Okay. So, okay.
Oh, I need someone to enable screen sharing though, so I can.
Santiago, can you enable Sheen screen?
1 minute. Yes. All right. Yes. Now.
Okay, great. Oh, wait, hang on 1 second. All right, just give me a second here.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna briefly summarize, I think what I said before, since we are kind of starting over. So this presentation is based on a paper that will be coming out soon, in a couple of months, I think, in the journal Critical Times. Part of what prompted it is what I see as a resurgence of interest in Rosa Luxemburg's work in recent years. A couple of examples are these recent publications that I've put on this slide. I guess one of the things that I find interesting and slightly problematic about that resurgence of interest in Luxemburg's work is that, although I think it's prompted partly by the fact that folks who are going back to Marx and Marxism and the critique of capitalism now are interested in rethinking Marx and the Marxist tradition in light of post-colonial and decolonial critique, and that's a good thing. I think there's a little bit of a tendency in some of the current resurgence of interest in Luxemburg's works to downplay a bit her commitment to the Marxist theory of history. So that's just a little bit of the background for the motivation for this talk. There are two pieces in particular that I discuss in the longer version of this article that I'll just mention because some of you might be familiar with them. One is Jacqueline Rose's piece on Luxemburg I think from 2011, which is really written against the background of the Arab Spring and really emphasizes Luxemburg's the kind of account of political spontaneity and kind of reads Luxemburg as a radical Democrat, I would say, almost an Arendtian reading of Luxemburg. And then the other is Leah Yuppie's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Luxemburg, which was published in 2022, which positions Luxemburg as a kind of intersectional theorist, avant la lettre, you might say. And I think, these are both interesting readings of Luxemburg, but one of my concerns is that both of them seem to downplay Luxemburg's commitment to a pretty orthodox understanding of the Marxist theory of history. And I think if we're going to, take Luxemburg's work seriously, we have to grapple with that commitment and the ways that it impacts her legacy and her relevance for contemporary critical theory. So my kind of primary thesis is just that Luxemburg remained thoroughly committed to an orthodox understanding of the Marxist theory of history, more or less throughout her entire career. There's one little moment where she goes back on or rethinks a part of it at the very end of her life, but we could talk about that if folks want. But and that commitment forms. It's not incidental to her thinking. It forms, as I say, the systematic backbone of her thought, and of actually all of the elements of her thought that look so appealing to a lot of contemporary scholars. So her revolutionary radicalism that comes out in her debate with Edward Bernstein, her theory of political spontaneity and democracy, and her critique of imperialism. My argument is that all of these aspects of her thought are deeply undergirded by her understanding of the Marxist theory of history. and that this is really a problem that we have to think through if we want to return to Luxemburg's work now. Now, as a caveat, I would say, there's a whole obviously interesting and important debate about, could say, whether there is such a thing as the Marxist theory of history, if so, what it is, whether or not Marx himself ever believed it, et cetera. I think those are important interpretive questions, and I've been doing some work myself on some of those issues, but I'm not going to focus on any of that here because it's really too complicated to get into. I mean, we'd never be able to get to talking about Luxemburg if we spent all of our time talking about that. So I really just want to focus on the idea that whatever we think about Marx's own commitments to a theory of history, I think Luxemburg herself was committed to such a theory, and maybe even more so than Marx himself. So what do I mean by the Marxist theory of history? So obviously, again, that's a complex topic, but the way that I want to present it, it has three core commitments. So the first is to some belief in a kind of necessity or inevitability to historical processes. And I'll say more about what I mean by necessity or inevitability a little later on. The second is to some kind of conception of universal history, or to the idea that there's a universality to a universal trajectory to that unfolding of history. And then finally, a commitment to the idea of historical progress. So what I'm saying is I think that we can see each of these commitments in Luxemburg's own theory of history, and that these commitments then complicate her legacy for contemporary critical theory. So the structure of the talk is really to look at three moments in Luxemburg's work. The first is her debate with Bernstein from around 1899. The second is her account of the mass strike. And then the third is her discussion of the accumulation of capital, and to show how the theory of history is, or my aim is to show how the theory of history is deeply entwined with the arguments that she's making at each of those moments. So I will start with Reform or Revolution, her debate with Edward Bernstein from 1899. So her critique of Bernstein was really pivotal in launching Luxemburg, who was then quite young, only 27 years old, as a major figure in the German socialist movement and a leader of its revolutionary wing. And so the target of her critique was what we could call Bernstein's reformism. And there were a few key elements of Bernstein's view that Luxemburg was particularly critical of. So Bernstein himself saw his contribution in the preconditions of socialism as offering a critical reading of the Marxist theory of history. And that reading had several components. So one was the claim that capitalism is not, in fact, on the verge of a collapse. And so thus the kind of crisis theory inherent in Marxist thinking, or integral to Marxist thinking, really had to be rethought. Second was the idea that the transition to socialism on Bernstein's account could be accomplished through parliamentary reform. So a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat was not, in his view, necessary. And third was the commitment to the idea that the best way to achieve that transition is through expanding existing democratic institutions. So for Bernstein then, as he says in this quote at the bottom of the slide, democracy is both means and end. It is a weapon in the struggle for socialism, and it is the form in which socialism will be realized. So in her critique of Bernstein, Luxemburg presents the opposition between reform or revolution as a version of the question to be or not to be. So she sees this as quite a stark choice. And she makes several points. One is to insist that the realization of socialism is distinct from the reform of capitalism, and that realizing socialism requires radical revolutionary change. And importantly for Luxemburg, pursuing reform is fine. I mean, she was not actually opposed to the pursuit of piecemeal reforms, but she saw them as a means to the ultimate end of revolution rather than an end in themselves. So they could serve, reform efforts and initiatives could serve for her as ways of educating and mobilizing workers. And in that sense, they could have a positive role to play. So things like trade unions, cooperatives, parliamentary reforms could be important parts of an overall strategy on Luxemburg's view, but she insisted that they could not and would not lead to the end of capitalism. I mean, because they all amount to ways of basically adjusting or reforming capitalism from within. So Luxemburg also had a very different understanding then of democracy than Bernstein. So for her, liberal democracy is not a precondition of socialism, but in fact, a bourgeois impediment to it. And in fact, she would kind of reverse Bernstein's idea and claim that socialism is a precondition of true democracy. So we can't have true democracy without socialism. And so in some way, I think, you could see the core issue of the Luxemburg-Bernstein debate as posing the question of whether or not meaningful change could come from within the current system, or rather must instead come from without. I think that's one of the aspects of it that makes this debate still feel really alive and fresh when we read it today. And I find actually that students really respond quite enthusiastically to this debate, because I think there's a lot in it that is still very relevant to a lot of different social and political, progressive social and political movements. But what I want to emphasize is not so much this broad question of whether or not change has to come from outside of the system or within it. I mean, that's a piece of it, but I want to connect that idea to the way that Luxemburg understands the theory of history. And I think this passage from the essay Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy helps to bring that out. So Luxemburg writes, the international movement of the proletariat toward its complete emancipation is a process peculiar in the following respect. For the first time in the history of civilization, the people are expressing their will consciously and in opposition to all ruling classes. But this will can only be satisfied beyond the limits of the existing system. Now, the mass can only acquire and strengthen this will in the course of the day-to-day struggle against the social order that is within the limits of the capitalist society. On the one hand, we have the mass, on the other, its historic goal located outside of existing society. On the one hand, we have day-to-day struggle, on the other, the social revolution. Such are the terms of the dialectical contradiction through which the socialist movement makes its way. So this inside-outside kind of dialectic for Luxemburg is, I think, connected to the way that she understands a kind of historical beyond or outside of capitalism. And that's really the point that I want to get at. It's the ability to see a historical beyond to capitalism that ultimately undergirds Luxemburg's revolutionary radicalism, or that's the point that I want to get to anyway. So Bernstein, by giving up on this idea of the objective necessity of socialism, or an understanding that explains socialism as the result of the material development of society, ends up necessarily reducing socialism to a mere utopian ideal. And repeatedly in her critique of Bernstein, Luxemburg insists that the belief in the inevitability of capitalism's collapse and an inevitability that leads to socialism, which is, she says, only another aspect of the same phenomenon. This belief is utterly central to Marxism. Okay, so I mean, I think what I want to say here is that Luxemburg's revolutionary radicalism is undoubtedly attractive, and I think it's tempting to look down on Bernstein as a kind of, you know, milquetoast reformist or something. So I'm not particularly interested in defending Bernstein's reformism, and I also don't want to question the idea that we need a radical critique of capitalism. But I think it's important to note that Luxemburg's own revolutionary fervor was sustained by her faith in the objective necessity or historical inevitability of capitalism's overcoming. And so we have to ask, I think, what could sustain such fervor for us if we can no longer share that faith? So does Luxemburg's faith in the inevitability or necessity of the demise of capitalism and the emergence of socialism commit her to some form of historical determinism, you know, that we would find objectionable today? And if so, we might wonder how such a commitment is compatible with her emphasis on the spontaneous democratic self-organization of revolutionary actors. And so that's a point that I want to turn to now with a discussion of her 1906 text, The Mass Strike. So here, the point that I want to emphasize is that the notion of necessity or inevitability here is I think, quite complicated. So for Luxemburg, revolution, or the way she understands the mass strike, is that it's at the same time necessary, inevitable, and rooted in objective social conditions, and dependent on the spontaneous self-organization of social actors. So there's no contradiction for Luxemburg between historical necessity and political spontaneity. The two go hand in hand, which means it won't really work, if one wants to suggest that Luxemburg doesn't believe in or isn't committed to a claim about historical necessity or inevitability, it won't work to emphasize her account of political spontaneity, because she sees no contradiction between an account of political spontaneity and an account of historical necessity. So I think the challenge is to kind of grapple with how she understood those two things as being connected. And so one way to think about it is that historical necessity has both a subjective and an objective sense for Luxemburg. So subjectively, a kind of claim of historical inevitability or necessity of the demise of capitalism or the emergence of socialism is a kind of exhortation. It's a kind of plea for workers to rise up and overthrow capitalism or institute socialist forms. And I think there is that sense of necessity in Luxemburg's work, clearly. I mean, so when she talks about necessity, in historical necessity, she isn't always talking in an objective mode. She's sometimes, using it as a way of saying, surely workers must, in this kind of condition, rise up and demand the formation of socialist institutions. But there is also this objective side, or objective use of the term historical necessity for her. And when in that mode, it almost has the status of a prediction. I mean, prediction might be slightly too strong, but anyway, it's an analysis of objective historical tendencies and the direction in which they're moving, right? In that sense, it's meant to have a kind of predictive power. So Luxemburg does have a really interesting account of political spontaneity and of the role of grassroots, bottom-up, spontaneous, democratic political action in generating and sustaining revolutionary movements. But for her, the contrary of spontaneous is not necessary, caused, or determined, but rather centrally planned. So when she's talking about spontaneity, she's really trying to distinguish that from an account of revolutionary change that would locate the impetus or energy of that change in a kind of central party planning mechanism. And so here her critique of Lenin is really important. So the mass strike for Luxemburg is a historical phenomenon that results, as she says, from social conditions with historical inevitableness. It's at the same time, it emerges out of the spontaneous action of political actors. So it kind of is both at the same time. So in that sense, the mass strike is historically emergent, not artificially generated or made. In other words, it can't be planned or imposed from above or from a central planning mechanism. Because of that, it can't be understood through what she calls abstract speculations or through subjective criticism issued from the standpoint of what is desirable. It can only be grasped through what she calls an objective investigation of the sources of the mass strike from the standpoint of what is historically inevitable. So I take that to mean that precisely because the mass strike cannot be imposed by party leaders or carried through by a small cadre of well-trained workers, there's no point in theorizing about whether staging a mass strike would be a good idea. A mass strike must emerge organically from a series of concrete, ongoing, and intertwined social and economic struggles. So given its organic nature, the mass strike is not just historical, but it's also, as she says, a natural historical phenomenon. And she uses a lot of very vivid organic or natural metaphors to describe the mass strike. So it is, she says, a bit of pulsating life and blood. The mass strike is connected with all parts of the revolution by 1,000 veins. It is a ceaselessly moving, changing sea of phenomenon. And as I put on the slide, it is the living pulse beat of the revolution, which is probably the most famous of her organic metaphors. So from a subjective perspective, the mass strike can be realized only through a multiplicity of varied forms of action. But considered objectively, the mass strike is the natural result of the developmental unfolding of a collective organism. Spontaneous political action for Luxemburg emerges from objective historical conditions, and both of these contribute to this unfolding. So to emphasize this, however, is not to say that, to emphasize the objective historical conditions that form the basis for the emergence of the mass strike is not to say that activists should simply sit back and wait for the revolutionary situation to fall from the clouds, as she says. So Luxemburg does maintain that the mass strike cannot succeed unless the conditions for it are ripe, that is, unless and until the objective historical situation is one that supports revolutionary transformation. But still, there's much that social actors can do to facilitate this set of objective historical conditions. And again, contra Lenin, this is not for Luxemburg a matter of issuing plans or blueprints or slogans, but rather of providing what she calls political leadership. And this political leadership for Luxemburg involves educating and preparing the proletariat for the emergence of the revolutionary situation, precisely by making clear to them its inevitability. So I think that's interesting. There's this kind of complicated, like, facilitation of spontaneous political action precisely through educating workers about the inevitability of the historical transformation that they then would play a spontaneous part in. So in other words, party leaders can play an active role for Luxemburg in fostering the objective historical conditions for revolutionary transformation, precisely by cultivating the creativity and spontaneity of the masses, but they do this by educating the masses about the objective historical conditions and thus about the inevitability of the coming transformation. Okay, so in other words, subjective spontaneity and objective historical necessity must come together in the right way and at the right time for the mass strike to emerge. Now, in addition to emphasizing the role of historical necessity or inevitability in the mass strike, Luxemburg also presents the mass strike as part of a progressive, and I think it's fair to say even universal historical development, because for her, and the pamphlet, The Mass Strike, is a reflection on the 1905 Russian Revolution. And for her, the 1905 Russian Revolution was not an isolated event, but it's rather a moment in a broader historical development that connects earlier bourgeois revolutions with the coming socialist revolution. And thus she writes, the mass strike is thus shown to be not a specifically Russian product, but a universal form of the proletarian class struggle resulting from the present stage of capitalist development and class relations. From this standpoint, the three bourgeois revolutions, the Great French Revolution, the German Revolution of March, and the present Russian Revolution, form a continuous chain of development in which the fortunes and the end of the capitalist century are to be seen. So in other words, the Russian Revolution is not something specifically Russian, even though she says it emerges in the most backward country of all. It has universal historical significance. It's a harbinger of things to come, an example that shows the ways and methods of further class struggle to the proletariat of Germany and the most advanced capitalist countries. So this, and it's embedded in a longer progressive developmental arc or trajectory. Now, to be sure, this developmental process, Luxemburg says, is not a straight line, but rather a lightning-like zigzag. So I'm not suggesting that her understanding of progress is like a linear one. I mean, she's a revolutionary Marxist, so she has a dialectical understanding of progress. And yet, as contradictory as this developmental arc may be, the historical arc that stretches from the French to the Russian Revolution is at the same time a universal and progressive one. And even the emergence of capitalism itself has to be understood as a part of that progress. That is, as a historical achievement that for all its exploitation, force, and brutality, generates the material conditions for socialism. So as Luxemburg herself puts the point, capitalism furnishes, besides the obstacles, also the only possibilities of realizing the socialist program. So Luxemburg's emphasis on spontaneity, freedom, and democracy as crucial elements of revolutionary politics is certainly very appealing, I think, especially compared with Lenin's defense of centralized party structures. I mean, of course, someone like Jody Dean would, I think, defend the Lenin account of centralized party structures, but I find Luxemburg's emphasis on spontaneity myself more congenial. And I think it's very tempting to read her as, for example, Jacqueline Rose does in the piece that I mentioned at the beginning, as a kind of Arendtian radical Democrat, as a thinker who prized the freedom, spontaneity, and unpredictability of action to core. And I think Arendt herself may kind of open the door to this reading in the piece that she wrote on Luxemburg in Men in Dark Times, which is actually a review of the original version of Joseph Nettle's biography of Luxemburg, I think was published in 1969. But what this type of reading misses, I think, is the extent to which Luxemburg's account of spontaneity goes hand in hand with her belief in the universal, progressive, and inevitable character of the objective historical conditions that give rise to revolutions. So readers such as Rose, I think, refrain from asking, whether and how Luxemburg's commitments to spontaneity, freedom, and democracy could be disentangled from the theory of history in which they're embedded. Okay, so moving on to the last section, I'm going to now turn to Luxemburg's 1913 text, The Accumulation of Capital. Because it's in this text that the contradictory and crisis-ridden historical development of the objective conditions of capitalism's demise receives its fullest exploration in Luxemburg's work. And in some sense, this text is a bit of a departure from Luxemburg's earlier work because it's, as far as I know, the first of her works that offers an extensive critique of Marx's critique of political economy. But what's interesting is that far from distancing herself from Marx's theory of history in this critique, Luxemburg doubles down on it. And if anything, I think The Accumulation of Capital could be read as Luxemburg's attempt to do a better job than Marx himself did of explaining the inevitability of capitalism's downfall using his own conceptual framework. So, as I think I mentioned at the outset, the accumulation of, well, maybe I didn't mention it, but anyway, the accumulation of capital is most appreciated these days, I think, for highlighting the ongoing structural role of imperialism and capitalism, which Luxemburg articulates through her interpretation of Marx's account of primitive accumulation. And this is obviously a really crucial and consequential aspect of her argument, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it emerges as the response to a pretty technical question that's actually internal to Marx's critique of value. And the question is, how does value expand or accumulate? And it's within this context, I think, that we have to understand Luxemburg's critique of imperialism, because it emerges out of this context, there are some, I think, significant limitations to that critique. So obviously the question of how capital accumulates is hugely important to Marx's mature critique of capitalism, because capital's ongoing, continually expanding self-valorization is really core to his understanding of capitalism in his late work. And Luxemburg's argument is that Marx himself is never able to answer this crucial question at the level of what she calls the total social capital, or the capitalist society as a whole, as opposed to the individual firm. And in fact, she suggests that Marx cannot answer this question with his own conceptual framework. That's sort of her imminent critique of Marx's critique of political economy in this text. And the reasons for it are somewhat technical, but I mean, I think at a kind of, in a nutshell, I'm going to present her reasoning. So the idea is that in order for total social capital to continually expand, the surplus value that's generated through wage labor has to be converted into saleable commodities. And this process requires an ongoing expansion of effective demand that, according to Luxemburg, cannot be met from within a capitalist society. And that's for like structural reasons. So the workers can't meet the effective demand because they don't have the resources, because their wages are set at a level of, bare subsistence and bare reproduction of them as workers, and that doesn't allow for them to meet this this effective demand. And the capitalist is kind of by definition is trying to conserve profits in order to reinvest them, and so is not also in a position to meet this effective demand. So for structural reasons, then, capitalism is thoroughly dependent on a non- or pre-capitalist outside that serves not only as a source of raw materials and labor power, but also, and this is the kind of crucial point, as a market for the goods whose sale allows for the realization of surplus value. So it's in that sense, and for that reason, that primitive accumulation is an ongoing structural necessity of capitalism in Luxemburg's account, rather than a historical kind of pre-capitalist moment. And of course, there's also a whole debate on whether or not Marx himself understood it as a historical moment or a structural one condition. And, you know, and to that extent, there's a question about how innovative Luxemburg's reading is here. I think I want to set that issue aside and just focus on Luxemburg's own reading, which insists that capitalism in its full maturity also depends in all respects on non-capitalist strata and social organizations existing side by side with it. The accumulation of capital becomes impossible in all points without non-capitalist surroundings. Capital needs the means of production and the labor power of the whole globe for untrammeled accumulation. It cannot manage without the natural resources and the labor power of all territories. And it's this structural necessity that gives rise to colonialism and imperialism, but also to militarism more generally and to soft forms of imperialism such as international debt, credit, and finance markets. But it's also this structural necessity that for Luxemburg in the accumulation of capital will inevitably lead to capitalism's downfall. So as it expands, capitalism systematically destroys and dismantles its very conditions of possibility by drawing all existing non- or pre-capitalist economies into itself. And the logical conclusion of this process is the complete domination of capitalism over the entire world. But if and when that were to happen, capital would then be unable to realize itself and all further accumulation would cease. But since this understanding of capitalism takes the ongoing accumulation and expansion of capital to be definitive of what capitalism is, the standstill of accumulation means that the development of productive forces is arrested and the collapse of capitalism follows inevitably as an objective historical necessity. Okay, so I also want to talk for a minute about the way that Luxemburg sees the collapse of capitalism and the accumulation of capital, not just as an objective historical necessity, but also as embedded in a longer arc of progress. And I think this quote from the Junius pamphlet brings that out. So she writes, "This brutal victory parade of capital through the world, its way prepared by every means of violence, robbery, and infamy, has its light side." Oh, and I should point out that in this slide, I've the italicized parts, that's my emphasis, not hers. So I've added that in. So it has its light side. It creates the preconditions for its own final destruction. It put into place the capitalist system of world domination, the indispensable precondition for the socialist world revolution. Thus, the capitalist victory parade and all its works bear the stamp of progress in the historical sense. And in this sense, imperialism ultimately works for us. So imperialism creates the subjective and objective conditions for the demise of capitalism and the emergence of socialism. And this is, as Luxemburg puts it, its light side. Furthermore, in the same text, Luxemburg indicates an ongoing commitment to a universal stadial account of the stage of historical development, according to which we can as little skip a stage of historical development as escape our own shadow. Elsewhere in her lectures on political economy, Luxemburg brings the ideas of progress and universality together when she emphasizes her commitment to understanding history as a developmental series conceived as a unitary process, an advance of humanity from lower to higher forms of life. So imperialism ultimately works for us. This claim could make sense only if Luxemburg assumes that imperialism, for all its horrors, creates both the objective and subjective conditions for the emergence of socialism. This is, as I said a minute ago, its light side, a side that is revealed only ultimately after the inevitable social revolution. With this claim, it becomes clear that her incisive critique of imperialism notwithstanding, Luxemburg has taken on board the considerable Eurocentric baggage that plagues the Marxist theory of history. Passionate though her critique of imperialism and its racist, civilizing, quote unquote, civilizing logic may be, this critique is embedded in the kind of historicist thinking, replete with talk of backward peoples and primitive economies that recurs frequently in Section 3 of the Accumulation of Capital, that is utterly central to imperialist ideology. So I think we have to ask whether and how we can take up Luxemburg's critique of imperialism anew. And is that critique indelibly marked by the kind of historicist commitments that have been so thoroughly criticized by post-colonial, Black radical, and indigenous readers of Marx and the Marxist tradition? And if not, how can these two strands of her thinking be disentangled? Okay, so I want to just begin to conclude here by coming back to some of the questions I've been trying to pose throughout this talk. So the first, with respect to reform or revolution, the question is whether and how Luxemburg's radical critique of capitalism can be disentangled from her faith in the objective necessity or historical inevitability of its revolutionary overthrow. Second, looking back to her account of the mass strike, the question is whether and how her emphasis on the role of spontaneity, democracy, and freedom in revolutionary movements can be disentangled from her account of the objective historical conditions that make such movements not only possible, but inevitable in some sense of that term. And then finally, whether and how we can disentangle her trenchant critique of imperialism from the progressive, and I think we could call it epistemically imperialist logic that governs her understanding of history. And I think to the extent that some of the contemporary Luxemburg Renaissance avoids such questions, it doesn't allow us to get a clear-eyed assessment of Luxemburg's legacy. And it also makes it harder to face up to the depth of the challenge faced by those of us who would like to reclaim the legacy of Marxism today in the wake of post and decolonial, indigenous, and Black and feminist critiques of the Marxist theory of history. So inspirational though Luxemburg's work has been for a whole host of radical critical theorists, critics of settler colonialism, Arendtian radical Democrats, feminist theorists of social reproduction, and so on, all of whom I think would themselves reject Marxist theory of history, her own work is considerably more complicated and even contradictory. So I think contemporary readers like Jacqueline Rose, for example, are right to highlight Luxemburg's emphasis on spontaneity, but wrong if they do so in a way that obscures or denies her commitment to the objective historical conditions that must be sufficiently ripe if spontaneous political movements are to emerge and be successful. Subjective spontaneity and objective historical necessity are not only for her conceptually compatible, they also have to come together in practice in the right way and at the right time in order for revolutionary movements to gain traction. Now, to be sure, as Rose argues, there is an element of unpredictability and uncertainty inherent in Luxemburg's account of spontaneity. And she was certainly enough of a realist, a political realist, to know that revolutions come with no guarantees. But this does not mean, as I think Rose suggests, that Luxemburg understood history as an open-ended or contingent process. On the contrary, Luxemburg dismissed any denial of the very lawfulness of social development as bourgeois social science. And similarly, contemporary readers are right to highlight Luxemburg's attentiveness to the role of racism, slavery, and militarism in the global expansion of capitalism. But to read her as a theorist of racial capitalism or an intersectional theorist avant la lettre, and I think Jane Anna Gordon and Drusilla Cornell's introduction to the Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg volume presents her as a kind of theorist of racial capitalism. and Leah Dupuis' Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article describes her as an intersectional theorist. I think these readings run the risk of failing to appreciate the distinctiveness of these critical projects. By folding racism and imperialism into the progressive developmental logic of history, as she does when she claims that imperialism ultimately works for us, Luxemburg runs afoul of what Siddhant Isser has described as one of the core insights of theories of racial capitalism, namely the imbrication of racialization, colonization, and capitalist accumulation in a non-reductive way. And relatedly, to the extent that Luxemburg's theorism of racism and imperialism is subsumed within her account of capital accumulation, I think she's implicitly committed to denying what is arguably a central tenet of intersectional theorizing, namely the equality or equiprimordiality of oppressions. So where does this leave us? I think the value of reading Luxemburg today in the wake of post-colonial, indigenous, Black, and feminist criticisms of the Marxist theory of history cannot be to say that she already has the answers that we need. And so I would disagree with those who've argued that Luxemburg's work provides a way of pushing back against these types of criticisms of Marx. Rather, I think her legacy consists in helping us to see more clearly the challenges that we face, how to articulate a radical critique of contemporary capitalism and a vision of revolutionary transformation that holds its vision of the future open, how to ground such a vision in a diagnostic assessment of current material conditions that is attuned to practical possibilities without losing sight of historical contingency. And perhaps most importantly, how to develop a genuinely intersectional critique of racial capitalism that avoids subsuming racism and colonialism into the developmental logic of capitalism. Okay. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Amy. Thanks a lot for your great talk. And first of all, I want to apologize again on behalf of the group for what happened with the hacking before. It never happened to us before, but we'll be more cautious in the future. So now, as you see, many people from our group and our colleagues are online. So I will open the floor for some questions from the audience, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
So we will collect some questions and then you will answer, or you prefer, okay. Okay.
I mean, however you like, you tell me.
So just raise your hand or, yes. So wait, Agustín?
Yes, thank you, Amy, for your presentation. So I found it really interesting, the discussion that you are like proposing with your reading of Rosa Luxemburg. So I have a lot of questions, but I would try to restrict myself to the content of your presentation. So the interest in your work and the relation between this new approach to the concept of history and your works on the question of progress. I will not ask about that, but so I will just ask you about your argumentation that you share with us today. So my question is, why should we identify the perspective on collapse, on or the question of crisis in capitalism with a sentiment of faith? Because I think that maybe Marxism or even critical theory can give us a lot of elements to have a strong theory of crisis, even of the collapse, without associating it necessarily with a hope or a faith of the way in which this crisis give rise necessarily to a social transformation or revolution. So behind my question is maybe that we are assisting today, we are witnessing today a kind of experience of collapse, of crisis, but at the same time, I think that we share the absence of any faith about how this collapse would necessarily give rise or being associated with a socialist transformation as a logical process or objective process, right? So my question was is this: why should we think the theory of Rosa Luxemburg's of collapse or capitalist crisis with this subjective image of religious sentiment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's my term, not hers. So so maybe it's not the best term to use. But I mean, you could just, it probably not much would be lost if I just said belief instead. But it does seem like, you know, reading Luxemburg now, we're obviously doing it with the, you know, the intervening 100 or so years of history, and in that way, something like maybe what's coming in there is a little bit of my own, you know, view of like the exhaustion of utopian energies or something like that. But that I think has been the outcome of that history, at least in Europe and the US. So yeah, I take your point. I mean, it also maybe will allow me to say that one of the kind of details that I skipped over in this presentation has to do with the relationship between the collapse of capitalism and the emergence of socialism in Luxemburg's thought. So I think in kind of her earlier work, like I have some of the passages from Reform or Revolution that I cited, she pretty much equates those two things. But by the time, toward the end of her life, she actually sees them not as the same thing. So, you know, she has the famous formulation, I believe it's in the Junius pamphlet, of, you know, the world of 1914 faces a fateful choice, and the choice is between socialism or barbarism. And the reason that's a choice for her is that I think she associates the collapse of capitalism, which is in some sense objective and inevitable, with potentially leading to barbarism, right? And in that sense, socialism is, you know, an alternative path that we could take or something like that. So that's a moment where it looks like this inevitability claim about, you know, the emergence of socialism gets attenuated a little bit. I mean, the thing is, I don't know that it's like that's a consistently maintained view, because even after she writes that, she still goes on to talk about the objective, you know, emergence of socialism and so on. So, as I read her, like the overall position is that in some sense, both are inevitable, both the collapse of capitalism and the emergence of socialism. But there is this interesting moment when she sort of takes up the socialism or barbarism idea, where she's like, well, there's two possible paths in front of us. And it's clear she thinks the demise of capitalism is inevitable. What comes next is maybe in some of her moments a bit of an open question. And there, the kind of necessity that kicks in is this idea of like, well, surely the working class must rise up, and, you know, and this is the moment, the demise of capitalism is imminent, and this is the moment to like engage in socialist revolution. So, so that whole story is a little bit more complicated in the paper than what I had time to present today. And just, I don't know, it's fine with me if you wanted to ask about the relationship between this project and the End of Progress, since you all talked about it in your group. I mean, there is a relationship, and I have things to say about it if you'd like to ask.
Okay, it will be nice, because we read like your last work on psychoanalysis also, but now with this paper that you share with us, we see more like obviously a continuation about the discussion of history that was maybe not so was part of the book on critical theory on the couch, but was not the central subject of the book. So it would be nice if you want to like maybe to reconnect that topic, but maybe the other persons also want to.
Yes. So I can maybe ask you a question about this actually.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to apologize again. I'm still on shock. This is like the first time that something like this happened to us. We have made several talks during the whole year, and this never happened to us. So I'm sorry for that.
No, it's okay. No need to apologize.
And that's the reason why we have restricted the access to this other meeting just for the people from our group. So, Amy, thank you again for your presentation. Yes, I have a really general question, but it's related with this last thing you said. Considering especially what the topics and problems that you have discussed in your last two books, I mean, The End of Progress and Critique on the Couch, I want to ask you if you have some hypotheses or some ideas related to what someone like Rosa Luxemburg can offer to the discussions of critical theory. I mean, the current situation of critical theory today, critical theory of society with capital C and T. I mean, the tradition, the Frankfurt School tradition in some way. What do you think? What are your thoughts on the possible, I don't know, things that someone like Rosa Luxemburg can offer to the discussions that are happening right now in the contemporary scene of critical theory? So maybe this can works to open, I mean, what you and Agustín just said, you know.
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, that this paper and some of the other things I'm working on at the moment that are connected to it are really come directly out of some of the critical responses to the end of progress. So, I mean, there were a lot of critical responses. I would say there were two lines of criticism that I kind of found most productive for my own thinking. And one of them was, there were a group of critics who were really upset, I would say, bothered by the way that I discussed very, very briefly and then sort of set aside Marx and Marxism in the first chapter of The End of Progress. So there were some really interesting papers that were published in a symposium in the journal Political Theory by Eve Winter and Claudia Lieb and Robert Nichols that all kind of circled around this question about Marx and Marxism and the role of Marxism in developing a critical theory of imperialism and of colonization, and, you know, and that just kind of circling around the idea that I really set aside Marxism entirely too quickly. And I think that's really fair as a critique of, you know, just what I say in the book. I mean, because I think I say something very quick about, you know, if we wanted to look for ways out of the kind of left Hegelian theory of history, you know, problematic theory of history that I'm criticizing, we have to look to the genealogical tradition, not the Marxist one. But I didn't like make an argument. I just said that, you know. So one of the things I've been doing in the last couple of years is trying to go back to Marx and to the Marxist tradition and you know, try to think through some of these questions about, what is Marx? So there's a whole bunch of interpretive questions. What is Marx's theory of history? Is it something he holds on to throughout his entire career or not? How does it inform or not his mature critique of capitalism, et cetera? And then what, becomes of that theory of history in subsequent Marxist traditions. And that's, of course, a huge question because there's just so many different strands of Marxist thought that one could look at. And so that's part of what's prompted like this paper. And I guess even more directly, I would say, one of the other criticisms of the end of progress that I thought was really, important and I took really seriously was this idea that it seemed a little strange that I had this whole argument in both the end of progress and Critique on the Couch of like returning to the early Frankfurt School as a way forward for contemporary critical theory. But I don't really talk about the critique of capitalism in either of those books. And that critique of capitalism was so hugely important. I mean, that was the project of the early Frankfurt School. So, what would it mean to kind of recover that project now without a critique of capitalism? That doesn't make any sense, really. So part of what I think, trying to do now is think about, okay, well, how do we go back to the critique of capitalism, but in a way that it has to be I want to take really seriously the kind of post-colonial and decolonial indigenous, Black Marxist critique of, or Black critical theory critiques of Marx that, that have really zeroed in on the theory of history. And so returning to Marx now has to be a different reading of Marx. And what are the resources for that? And I think Luxemburg is an interesting place to start in some ways, precisely because, as I said at the beginning of my talk, she's being held up as like this, this intersectional theorist of racial capitalism, this radical Democrat. Like there's all this kind of, I think, recovery of her. And even some readers like Peter Kudis who've suggested like, yeah, Luxemburg allows us to like respond to the kind of post-colonial critique of Marxism. And I'm a little more skeptical that Luxemburg, I mean, I think Luxemburg is great. She's brilliant. She's totally worth reading. She's incredible, She wrote The Accumulation of Capital in almost in one sitting in like 4 months. I mean, it's an incredibly brilliant, book, but I'm a little skeptical of the idea that she's got the resources that we need to do the kind of work that I think contemporary critical theory needs to do if it's going to go back to developing a kind of Marxist critique of capitalism, that can be responsive to the various critiques of Marxism that I think we need to take really seriously. So that's sort of the motivation. That's the connection to the end of progress. I would say I mentioned, that there were 2 lines of criticism of the end of progress that I took really seriously. One was this point about Marx and Marxism and the critique of capitalism, and that was a big hole in that project. And the other was really the lack of engagement with extensive engagement with non-European thinkers. So the whole idea that we can find some resources for addressing the problem with the way that the account of normativity goes in critical theory from, but by turning to other European thinkers, and that this is a way of, decolonizing critical theory's normative foundations. And I think that people who have said, that's a problematic move to look for a kind of decolonizing solution from within the European tradition. I think to some extent, I would have things to say in response if I wanted to, be in a mode of defending my work, but I also think that's an important point. And so one thing I've been doing too in this project is looking at some non-European, some more peripheral Marxist theorists. So I have a couple of papers on Enrique Dussels' work. I have a piece on W.E.B. Du Bois that was published about 2 years ago. So I've been trying to expand my own kind of archive, let's say. because I think one could think about how, you know, if you want to talk about Marxists who have productively rethought the critique of capitalism without taking on board the theory of history, there are some important European thinkers in that group. I mean, Althusser for sure, Adorno and Benjamin for sure, Gramsci, you know, so, but I'm trying to structure this project not by looking to that group, but more to kind of global Marxist thinkers as a way of shifting, you know, yeah, my own engagements.
So I will ask a question myself, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes. We know from your book, from the End of Progress, and from this presentation today, that you are very critical of teleological notions of history, like that of Rosa Luxemburg, or the idea of moral progress in contemporary critical theory. My question would be, do you think critical theory needs a philosophy of history, or should we give up to the philosophy of history? And the risk of that is falling into the trap of this idea that everything is contingent, maybe, if we don't have some conception of history. So my question would be, well, that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I guess I think I'm committed to saying we don't need a philosophy of history, and it generates more problems than it solves. I mean, it depends on what you mean by a philosophy of history, but if you mean, you know, something that is a reconstructed version of the classical, you know, conception of that, then I think I'm committed to saying that. I mean, I have tried to suggest, I don't think we can do without some idea of, if you don't want to call it progress, you could call it, you know, striving for, you know, improvement, or ameliorating injustice. I don't know, you know, there is some idea, I think, that is probably core to critical theory, that, you know, if it's supposed to be about some notion of emancipation, then that's, there are certain kinds of commitments that flow from that. But I don't think those have to be understood in like philosophy of history type of terms. I think I'm interested in thinking about, yeah, and in a more sort of problem-based approach, probably, and a little more piecemeal approach, and one that's grounded more not in a theory of history, but rather in a kind of diagnosis of existing relations, and structures of oppression and injustice. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm also, I mean, I think, you know, is there a danger to saying everything is contingent? I mean, it depends on, like, one of the things that I've tried to argue with respect to Foucault's understanding of history, because people will sometimes say, oh, you know, Foucault thinks history is just, it's all contingent, it's just one damn thing after another, you know, it doesn't mean anything. And I think that's, in a way, it's a very specific, there's a specific aim to that, which is, you know, trying to kind of read history, you know, in that way, is a way of dislodging some of our own, maybe even unreflexive commitments to a philosophy of history that are so, you know, deeply embedded in a kind of modern, whatever that means, standpoint. So there might be a value. So it's like contextual, right? There might be a value to thinking of history in terms of contingency, in terms of like taking up a critical perspective on the ways that certain philosophy of history commitments might be, you know, informing and distorting our projects. And that doesn't mean like one would have to understand history as contingent, like for all time. It's responding to a certain kind of problem, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I think Gustavo Robles wanted to ask something.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizations and also Ami. So I really enjoyed. I'm sorry for having the cam off. So the connection here is very weak. Just a question. Maybe I lost some part of your presentation, which I enjoyed a lot, of course. And my question is related to the concept of spontaneity, because you know, like Rosa Luxemburg died like before the rise of the Third Reich or the Third Reich, so before the rise of Hitler. Today we are like witnessing that also the spontaneity, also the critique and the movement against capitalism, against this status quo, the society, has not only a leftist, let's say, content, but can also have a background, like I don't know, like an anti-democratic and, you know, anti-revolutionary content, as we say all over the world. For example, here in Argentina, we are like, we are seeing, you know, like, no masses, but a lot of like a working class, also voting or supporting the far right, and also in a very spontaneous way. So in very spontaneous way, or we saw, for example, in France, like an uprising, a popular uprising with a very like some kind of reactionary content, for example. So for a while, what about this idea of, you know, what do you think, or what would you say, you know, from Rosa Luxemburg about this ambiguity, or about this, you know, like possibility of a reactionary content in the spontaneity?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, and I think pretty much everything that I wanted to say about her account of spontaneity was designed to push back against this kind of this reading of her as a radical Democrat, which I think is, I mean, in a sense that's true, but like, if you think about radical democracy in the, you know, in a kind of Arendtian way, I think that's not what she's really up to, because of the way that spontaneity is always for her connected to objective historical necessity. And she definitely had, yeah, I mean, maybe because she didn't have the historical experience, as you said, of, you know, of seeing how the collapse of the workers' movement, or the violent putting down of the workers' movement in Germany led to the rise of fascism, or was connected to the rise of fascism. So she didn't have necessarily that, you know, that wasn't informing her account of spontaneity. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I mean, I do, you know, I think that, I think critical theory has to be attentive to the demands that are being formulated in grassroots social movements. And so for that, like, Luxemburg's account of spontaneity is interesting. But I don't think spontaneity is politically valuable, like, you know, full stop. I mean, that's not my view. And I think even Luxemburg maybe has some resources for, you know, she has something to say about this, because there's a kind of push-pull for her between spontaneity on the one hand, you know, and this kind of like emerging, kind of naturally, organically emerging workers' movement, and you know, political leadership and education. So Luxemburg herself taught in the workers, taught workers the critique of political economy in Berlin in the like early 1910s, I think. And so she was really involved in that, you know, in that process of education. So it's not like, so spontaneity for her is distinct from something that's centrally planned or imposed, but it's not like anything goes. I mean, there's this idea of like political leadership and education as a way of kind of forming and facilitating the spontaneous, you know, democratic kind of grassroots, if you will, movements. So I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't know if that like would ultimately give her a way of responding to your question. I think it would probably be unsatisfying to say, you know, if only there was more political education, and leadership by members of the Socialist Party, then we wouldn't have seen fascism emerging in various places or something. But I do think she does have some things to say about the relationship between spontaneous movements and a kind of educated, critical political leadership that helps to guide, not to impose plans, but to guide and kind of facilitate that spontaneity. I don't think that's a satisfactory answer to your question, but I both want to sort of say, well, I'm not necessarily intending to endorse Luxemburg's account of spontaneity. That's point one. And then point two is I think she would have some things to say, but maybe not a fully satisfying answer to your question.
So
Thank you very much.
Sorry. We have one last question from Nelly, and
Yes.
she wrote, but I think Santiago is going to read it out loud.
Okay.
All right.
okay?
Yes, it's okay. I just want to add something else. When you were presenting your paper, I remember the discussion, the sort of discussion between, well, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and in some way also Lukács. I think that in some sense, critical theory has a lot to learn from, this all this discussion, especially this difference between spontaneity or spontaneism and vanguardism. So thank you for bringing all these subjects to the floor. Nelly has this question that says, well, she has a problem with her internet connection, so you write it down and says, taking into account the realities in Latin American countries, in my opinion, that mass strikes are not a natural response, but rather a reaction to systemic oppression and domination. So how might Luxemburg's perspective on her theory guide our understanding of contemporary socioeconomic dynamics in this region?
Yeah, this is very, I think, similar to the previous question. And I think, I'm not sure that she would have a good answer here. I think one thing to say is, I think Luxemburg would probably reject the premise or the idea that thinking of the mass strike as natural or in some sense organic is opposed to thinking of it as a reaction to oppression and domination. I think for her, those two things probably would go together because in her understanding of the mass strike in the Russian Revolution, she's looking at, a kind of natural, quasi-natural, natural historical, organic development that emerges spontaneously from certain objective historical conditions, and those objective historical conditions have everything to do with the systemic oppression and domination of workers and peasants, primarily peasants, I guess, in 1905 in Russia. But anyway, with a system of oppression and domination that is what the mass strike is emerging in response to. So I think she sees those two things probably as kind of going together. But I don't know that means that she would have, a satisfying account of contemporary socioeconomic dynamics in Latin America or anywhere else. And I think, precisely because of what came out in the previous question, which is, I don't know that she had a clear enough view of the ways that the spontaneous energies of oppressed workers, let's just take workers as the example for the moment, can lead in all sorts of directions, some of which are, politically progressive and others of which are politically reactionary. So, I think it's a little hard to fault her in a way. I think one has to keep in mind when reading Luxemburg and Marx too, on these kinds of questions, like, you know, what it must have looked and felt like to them at the moment that they were writing, which is a very different historical moment from our own, where, you know, in a moment in which I think it made some sense maybe to think about these revolutionary energies as, you know, continuing to gather steam and as just on the brink of, you know, bringing about a massive transformation and so on. And I mean, obviously things look really, really different from our point of view now. Not sure what else to say about that.
Well, if there's no other question, maybe we can finish here, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, fine with me.
So we would like to thank you again for your very interesting talk and for participating in our colloquium. And it was an honor to have you here. And again, we would like to apologize for what happened, but I think we managed it somehow. And
yes, I appreciate your yeah, just quickly regrouping and solving the problem. So that was great. Thank you. And thanks so much for the invitation and for reading and discussing my work and your group. I'm really pleased and, you know, and honored actually. So thank you so much.
Thanks
We
a
are
lot
looking
again.
forward for future translations of your work in Spanish.
What's that?
We are looking forward for future
yeah.
translations.
That would be great. I would love that. I don't know if any are in the works, but if I can help facilitate it, I would be happy to. So thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Have a nice evening.
You too.
You too.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.